The morning sun cast long shadows across the ceremonial grounds, as Marine Sergeant David Martinez adjusted his dress blue uniform one final time. Today marked the culmination of months of preparation for the international military ceremony honoring fallen soldiers from allied nations. Representatives from 12 countries would be present, including members of the British Royal Guard, known worldwide for their unwavering discipline and stoic presence. David had served 3 tours overseas, witnessed the chaos of battle, and stood firm under enemy fire. Yet today, something felt different. The weight of representing his unit, his country, and the memory of his fallen brothers pressed heavily on his shoulders. His polished brass buttons caught the light as he took his position at the memorial wall, where names of heroes were etched in black granite. The ceremony grounds buzzed with quiet activity as dignitaries, military officials, and families of the fallen began to arrive. Protocol officers moved efficiently, ensuring every detail met the exacting standards required for such a solemn occasion. David's commanding officer had specifically chosen him for this honor guard duty, citing his exemplary service record and unshakable composure under pressure. As David stood at attention, his mind wandered briefly to his childhood friend Marcus, whose name appeared on the wall behind him. They had enlisted together, dreamed of adventure together. But only David had returned home. This ceremony wasn't just about military precision for him. It represented a sacred trust to honor those who had made the ultimate sacrifice. The sound of approaching footsteps on the gravel path drew David's attention back to the present moment. A formation of royal guards approached with measured steps, their red tunics and bearskin hats creating an imposing sight against the morning sky. These soldiers represented centuries of British military tradition, having protected royalty and served their nation with distinction through countless conflicts and ceremonies. Among them walked Guard James Wellington, whose own journey to this moment had been equally challenging. Raised in a working-class family in Manchester, James had always dreamed of serving in the elite Royal Guard. Years of rigorous training, physical conditioning, and mental preparation had brought him to this prestigious position. Like David, he carried the weight of expectation and the honor of representing something greater than himself. The 2 formations approached the memorial site from opposite directions, creating a symbolic meeting of allied forces. As they drew closer, David noticed the intense concentration on the face of one particular royal guard. The man's eyes seemed to hold the same mixture of pride, duty, and underlying emotion that David felt coursing through his own veins. James, for his part, observed the American Marine with growing respect. The soldier's bearing spoke of experience and dedication, qualities that transcended national boundaries and united warriors across the globe. In that moment, both men recognized something familiar in each other, a shared understanding of the sacrifices required by their chosen profession. The ceremony began with traditional military honors, as representatives from each nation took their designated positions around the memorial. David and James found themselves stationed directly across from each other, separated by perhaps 20 feet of hallowed ground. The initial formalities proceeded smoothly, with speeches from dignitaries and the presentation of wreaths from each participating country. As the ceremony progressed, the weight of the moment seemed to intensify. Families of the fallen wept quietly, their grief a stark reminder of the human cost of military service. The reading of names began, each one representing a life cut short, dreams unfulfilled, and families forever changed. David's jaw tightened as Marcus's name echoed across the grounds, while James felt his own composure tested as names of British soldiers he had known personally were spoken aloud. The 2 soldiers maintained their military bearing throughout the emotional proceedings, their training and discipline holding firm despite the powerful emotions swirling around them. Yet neither could ignore the profound connection they felt to this moment, to the memories being honored, and increasingly, to each other across the ceremonial space. As the formal proceedings neared their climax, an unexpected silence fell over the gathering. The planned moment of remembrance had arrived, calling for 2 minutes of absolute quiet to honor the fallen. In this silence, something extraordinary began to unfold between the Marine and the Royal Guard, something that would transform this ceremony from a routine military function into an unforgettable testament to the bonds that unite soldiers across all boundaries. The ceremonial bugle call faded into the morning air, leaving behind a silence so profound that even the rustling of leaves seemed to pause in respect. David Martinez felt his breathing slow as the 2-minute remembrance period began. This was the moment when all present would honor the fallen in complete quiet, allowing their memories to fill the sacred space around the memorial wall. As David stood motionless, his eyes naturally found their way to the royal guard positioned directly across from him. James Wellington maintained perfect military posture, his red tunic immaculate, his bearskin hat casting a shadow over his weathered face. Yet David could see something stirring beneath the surface of the guard's professional exterior, a depth of emotion that mirrored his own internal struggle. James felt the American Marine's gaze and, despite his training to maintain forward focus during ceremonies, found his own eyes drawn to meet it. In that instant, something unprecedented happened. The carefully maintained barriers of military protocol seemed to dissolve as two warriors recognized the shared burden they carried. Both men had seen combat, lost brothers in arms, and understood the true cost of the freedom being celebrated around them. The silence stretched between them, but it was far from empty. In David's eyes, James saw the reflection of his own experiences, the weight of command decisions that haunted sleepless nights, and the profound responsibility of representing fallen comrades who would never return home. The Marine's steady gaze spoke of battles fought in distant lands, of young soldiers who had trusted him with their lives, and of the eternal debt owed to those whose names were carved in stone behind him. For David, looking into the Royal Guard's unwavering stare was like gazing into a mirror of shared sacrifice. He saw the discipline that came only through years of dedicated service, the quiet strength required to stand watch over others, and the deep wells of grief that every true soldier carries for those lost along the way. The guard's eyes held stories of their own, tales of duty performed in the face of danger, of traditions upheld across centuries of service. Around them, the ceremony continued in respectful silence. Families clutched photographs of their loved ones, officers maintained solemn postures, and the flags of allied nations hung motionless in the still air. Yet for David and James, the world had narrowed to this singular moment of connection, this unexpected bridge spanning the gap between two military traditions and two nations united in common purpose. The emotional weight of the moment began to build as both soldiers felt the presence of their fallen comrades almost tangibly. David's thoughts turned to Marcus, remembering their last conversation before that fateful patrol, the promises they had made to each other about returning home safely. The guilt he carried for surviving when his friend had not was a burden he shared with countless other veterans, a weight that never truly left his shoulders. James's mind wandered to Corporal Thomas Anderson, a young guard who had served under his leadership during a peacekeeping mission 2 years earlier. Thomas had been eager, dedicated, and full of life until an improvised explosive device had cut his story short. The responsibility James felt for every soldier under his command had shaped him into the man he was today. Just as David's experiences had molded his own character, neither man moved, yet their silent exchange grew more intense with each passing second. It was as if they were communicating without words, sharing experiences that only those who had worn the uniform could truly understand. The burden of leadership, the weight of loss, the pride of service, and the commitment to honor those who had made the ultimate sacrifice, all of these emotions passed between them in that charged silence. Other attendees began to notice the unusual intensity of the moment unfolding between the two honor guards. A photographer, initially focused on capturing the formal proceedings, found her camera naturally drawn to document this unexpected human connection. Even the ceremony's organizers, veterans themselves, recognized something extraordinary was occurring. The prescribed 2 minutes of silence stretched beyond its intended duration, as neither David nor James seemed capable of breaking the profound connection they had established. Their commanding officers, trained to maintain strict protocol, found themselves hesitating to interrupt what was clearly a moment of deep significance, not just for the two soldiers involved, but for everyone present who witnessed it. In that extended silence, both men felt something shifting within themselves. The isolation that often accompanies military service, the sense of carrying burdens that civilians could never fully comprehend, began to lift slightly. They were no longer alone in their grief, their guilt, or their commitment to honor the fallen. Across 20 feet of ceremonial ground, they had found a kindred spirit who understood without explanation the weight of the oath they had sworn. The moment had transcended its ceremonial origins, becoming something far more personal and profound. What had begun as a routine military function was transforming into a testament to the bonds that unite all who serve, regardless of nationality, rank, or background. Time seemed suspended as David and James continued their silent communion across the ceremonial grounds. What had begun as a moment of remembrance for the fallen had evolved into something far more personal and profound. Each man saw his own reflection in the other's eyes, recognizing the shared experiences that bound them together despite their different uniforms and national loyalties. The morning breeze stirred gently through the memorial garden, carrying with it the scent of the white lilies that had been placed at the base of each commemorative wreath. Yet neither soldier noticed these details, so completely absorbed were they in this unexpected connection that seemed to bridge not only the physical space between them, but also the emotional distances that military life often created. David felt a strange sensation washing over him, as if the walls he had built around his emotions were slowly crumbling. For years, he had compartmentalized his feelings about the war, about Marcus's death, about the responsibility he carried for the soldiers under his command. Military training had taught him to suppress these emotions, to function effectively, despite the weight of loss and trauma. But now, looking into the eyes of this British guard, he felt those carefully constructed barriers beginning to weaken. James experienced a similar phenomenon, though his own emotional journey had taken a different path. The rigid protocols of the Royal Guard had shaped him into a man of few words and controlled expressions, someone who could stand motionless for hours while protecting dignitaries or participating in state ceremonies. His ability to maintain perfect composure under any circumstances was legendary among his peers. Yet here, in this moment of profound silence, he felt something stirring deep within his chest that he had not experienced in years. The other ceremony attendees began to take notice of the extraordinary tableau unfolding before them. General Patricia Morrison, the American ceremony coordinator, found herself captivated by the intensity of the moment between her Marine and the British Guard. She had organized dozens of similar events throughout her career, but she had never witnessed anything quite like this silent exchange that seemed to communicate volumes without a single spoken word. Colonel Geoffrey Hartwell, the British liaison officer overseeing the Royal Guard contingent, initially felt concerned about the protocol breach represented by his guard's extended deviation from standard ceremonial posture. However, as he observed the profound nature of what was occurring, his military mind recognized that some moments transcended traditional regulations. This was clearly one of those rare instances when human connection superseded institutional requirements. Families of the fallen, initially focused on their own grief and memories, began to notice the unusual scene playing out between the two honor guards. Mary Patterson, whose son had served alongside David in Afghanistan, found herself drawn to watch the silent exchange. Something about the intensity of the moment reminded her of the deep bonds her son had described between soldiers who had served together in combat zones. Elena Rodriguez, a Gold Star mother whose son's name was carved into the memorial wall behind David, wiped tears from her eyes as she observed the profound respect being demonstrated by these two soldiers. Though she didn't fully understand what was happening between them, she could sense that it was connected to the same sense of duty and sacrifice that had driven her own son to make the ultimate commitment to his country and his fellow soldiers. The prescribed duration of the silence ceremony had long since passed, yet no one seemed willing to break the spell that had settled over the gathering. Even the military band, prepared to begin the next phase of the formal proceedings, remained at ready position, their conductor having signaled for them to wait, while this extraordinary moment continued to unfold. David found his thoughts turning to all the soldiers he had served alongside, not just Marcus but dozens of others who had shared foxholes, patrol routes, and the unique camaraderie that develops between people who depend on each other for survival. He thought about the letters he had written to families of the fallen, the funeral services he had attended, and the burden of being a survivor in a profession where survival was never guaranteed. James's mind traveled to similar territory, remembering the young guards he had mentored, the ceremonial duties he had performed at military funerals, and the weight of representing centuries of British military tradition. He thought about the oath he had sworn upon joining the Royal Guard, the promise to serve with honor and dignity regardless of personal cost, and the profound responsibility of standing watch over the memories of those who had given everything for their nation. Neither man was aware of how long they had been locked in this silent exchange, but both felt that something fundamental was shifting within them. The isolation that often accompanied military service, the sense of carrying burdens that few civilians could understand, was being transformed by this unexpected connection with a fellow warrior from across the Atlantic. As the minutes continued to pass, the silence between them deepened, rather than becoming awkward or uncomfortable. It was as if they were downloading years of shared experiences, communicating the weight of command, the pain of loss, and the pride of service through nothing more than sustained eye contact and mutual recognition of their common humanity beneath the uniforms they wore. The emotional intensity between David and James had reached a crescendo that seemed to affect everyone present at the memorial ceremony. What had begun as a routine military function was transforming into something far more profound, a moment that would be remembered long after the formal proceedings had ended. The silence stretched between them like a bridge spanning not just physical distance but the deeper chasms of military experience and personal loss. David felt his breathing deepen as waves of emotion he had suppressed for years began to surface. The rigid control he maintained over his feelings, essential for battlefield leadership and military effectiveness, started to crack under the weight of this unexpected human connection. His eyes, still locked with those of the Royal Guard, began to glisten with unshed tears that reflected both grief and a strange sense of relief he couldn't fully understand. James experienced a similar emotional awakening, though his journey to this moment had followed a different path. The stoic reserve that defined his service with the Royal Guard, the ability to remain unmoved by external circumstances that had made him legendary among his peers, was being challenged by forces beyond his control. His breathing became slightly irregular as he struggled to maintain the composure that had been drilled into him through years of intensive training. The morning sun climbed higher in the sky, casting shifting patterns of light and shadow across the memorial grounds. Yet neither soldier was aware of these changes, so completely absorbed were they in this profound moment of connection. The formal ceremony had essentially paused around them, as if the entire gathering recognized that something extraordinary was unfolding that transcended traditional military protocols. Dr. Sarah Henderson, a military psychologist who had been invited to observe the ceremony as part of her research into veteran trauma and healing, found herself documenting what she was witnessing. Her trained eye recognized the signs of deep emotional processing occurring between the two soldiers, the kind of breakthrough moment that therapists worked years to achieve with their patients. She realized she was observing something that could revolutionize understanding of military bonding and healing. Father Michael O'Brien, the chaplain who was scheduled to deliver the closing benediction, felt his own eyes moisten as he watched the silent exchange between David and James. In his years of providing spiritual support to military families, he had witnessed countless moments of grief, loss, and healing. Yet this wordless communication between two warriors from different nations seemed to embody the deepest principles of human connection and mutual understanding that his faith taught. The families present began to sense that they were witnessing something historically significant. Veterans in the audience, many of whom had attended numerous military ceremonies throughout their lives, recognized that this moment had transcended its formal origins to become something entirely unique. Cameras that had been focused on capturing routine ceremonial images were now documenting what appeared to be a profound human drama unfolding in real time. Ambassador William Thornton, the senior diplomatic representative overseeing international relations at the ceremony, initially felt concern about the protocol deviation represented by the extended silence. However, his decades of experience in international affairs had taught him to recognize moments of genuine cultural and human significance. He realized that this spontaneous display of military brotherhood might accomplish more for Allied relations than months of formal diplomatic negotiations. David's mind began to process memories he had buried deep within his consciousness, images and emotions from his deployments that he had never fully processed or shared with anyone. The weight of command decisions that had resulted in casualties, the guilt of surviving engagements that claimed the lives of soldiers under his protection, the overwhelming responsibility of writing letters to families of the fallen. All of these experiences seemed to flow between him and the British Guard, without need for verbal communication. James found himself reliving his own buried memories of loss and responsibility. The young guards he had mentored who had not returned from overseas assignments, the weight of maintaining Royal Guard traditions while dealing with modern military challenges, the isolation that came with holding oneself to impossibly high standards of conduct and performance. These experiences, never before shared with anyone outside his immediate military circle, seemed to find expression in his sustained connection with the American Marine. The silence between them had evolved beyond mere absence of sound to become a form of communication more profound than words could express. Each man felt understood in a way that he had never experienced before, recognized and accepted by someone who truly comprehended the weight of military service and the price of professional dedication. Other members of both military units began to notice the transformation occurring in their respective comrades. David's fellow Marines observed the subtle changes in his posture and breathing, recognizing signs of emotional processing that they had rarely seen in their stoic sergeant. Similarly, the other Royal Guards detected the slight variations in James's bearing that indicated deep internal activity beneath his traditionally impassive exterior. As the extended silence continued, both soldiers felt something shifting at the very core of their identities as military professionals. The walls they had built to protect themselves from the emotional toll of their service were not crumbling but rather becoming permeable, allowing for a kind of healing connection that neither had imagined possible within the context of their military lives. The morning had progressed far beyond the scheduled conclusion of the memorial ceremony, yet no one present seemed willing to interrupt the extraordinary moment that had developed between Marine Sergeant David Martinez and Royal Guard James Wellington. Their silent connection had become the focal point of the entire gathering, transforming a formal military function into something approaching a spiritual experience for all who witnessed it. David felt the first tear escape from his right eye, tracing a slow path down his cheek despite his years of training to maintain stoic composure under all circumstances. The emotional dam he had constructed to contain his grief over Marcus's death, his guilt about surviving when so many others had not, and his overwhelming sense of responsibility for the soldiers under his command, was finally beginning to crack. Yet rather than feeling ashamed or embarrassed by this display of vulnerability, he experienced an unexpected sense of liberation. James observed the tear on David's face with profound understanding, rather than judgment. In his own eyes, moisture was gathering as he confronted emotions he had buried beneath layers of Royal Guard protocol and British military tradition. The rigid self-control that had defined his entire adult life was being challenged by this American Marine's courage in showing authentic emotion, inspiring James to confront his own carefully suppressed grief over the soldiers he had lost and the weight of expectations he carried. The gathering around them had taken on an almost reverent quality, as if everyone present recognized they were witnessing something sacred and unrepeatable. Conversations had ceased entirely. Camera shutters had stopped clicking, and even the wind seemed to have stilled in respect for the profound human drama unfolding between the two honor guards. The formal structure of the ceremony had dissolved into something far more meaningful and authentic. General Morrison found herself deeply moved by what she was observing, recognizing in these two soldiers the embodiment of everything she had devoted her career to protecting and honoring. Her own eyes filled with tears as she remembered similar moments of connection she had experienced during her decades of military service, instances when the shared burden of leadership and loss had created bonds that transcended rank, nationality, and protocol. Elena Rodriguez, the Gold Star mother whose son's name was carved into the memorial wall, approached slowly and stood beside the general. Through her own tears, she whispered that watching these two soldiers honor her son and all the fallen through their silent communion was more meaningful than any speech or formal ceremony could have been. Their authentic emotion validated her grief, while celebrating the bonds that had made her son's sacrifice worthwhile. Dr. Henderson continued documenting the interaction, recognizing that she was witnessing a form of trauma processing and healing that traditional therapeutic methods struggled to achieve. The wordless communication between David and James seemed to be facilitating emotional breakthroughs that could take years to accomplish in clinical settings. She realized this moment could reshape understanding of military psychology and veteran healing. As the second tear joined the first on David's face, James felt his own emotional barriers finally giving way. A single tear appeared in his left eye, then slowly traced its way down his weathered cheek. For a man trained never to show emotion while on duty, this represented a monumental shift in his relationship with his own feelings and vulnerabilities. Yet instead of shame, he felt a profound sense of connection and healing. The other royal guards, initially concerned about their colleagues' protocol violation, began to understand that they were witnessing something far more significant than military regulations could encompass. Several of them had served in combat zones alongside James, and they recognized the emotional processing that was occurring. Rather than disapproval, they felt protective of this moment that was clearly providing their comrade with something he desperately needed. David's fellow Marines experienced similar recognition of their sergeant's emotional journey. They had served with him through multiple deployments, witnessed his dedication to his soldiers, and understood the weight he carried for those who had not returned home. Seeing him finally allowing himself to grieve and connect authentically with another warrior filled them with respect rather than concern about military bearing. Father O'Brien stepped forward quietly, positioning himself where he could offer support if needed, while being careful not to interrupt the sacred moment unfolding between the two soldiers. His experience counseling military personnel had taught him to recognize when profound healing was occurring, and he sensed that divine intervention was at work in this unexpected connection between warriors from different nations. The tears continued to flow down both soldiers' faces as years of suppressed emotion finally found expression. Neither man attempted to wipe away the moisture, recognizing somehow that this display of authentic feeling was essential to the healing process occurring between them. Their eyes remained locked, communicating depths of understanding that words could never have conveyed. Ambassador Thornton realized he was witnessing a moment that would likely be remembered and discussed for decades to come, a spontaneous display of military brotherhood that embodied the highest ideals of the allied relationship between their nations. He made a mental note to ensure that this extraordinary demonstration of shared humanity would be properly documented and honored in future diplomatic discussions. The silence between David and James had evolved into something approaching a sacred conversation, a wordless exchange of recognition, grief, healing, and mutual support that was transforming both men in real time. They felt the presence of all the soldiers they had lost, all the responsibilities they had carried, and all the isolation they had endured, but also the profound connection that could exist between warriors who truly understood each other's burdens. As their tears continued to fall, both soldiers felt something fundamental shifting within their souls, a healing that was occurring not through formal therapy or medical intervention, but through the simple yet profound recognition of shared humanity and common experience between two men who had dedicated their lives to serving something greater than themselves. The emotional crescendo between David and James had reached its peak, and gradually, almost imperceptibly, began to shift toward resolution. The tears on both men's faces continued to glisten in the morning sunlight, but their breathing had begun to slow and deepen, suggesting that the most intense phase of their silent communion was drawing to a close. Yet the profound connection between them remained undiminished, having evolved into something that would forever change both of their lives. David felt a sense of peace settling over him that he had not experienced since before Marcus's death. The crushing weight of survivor's guilt that had haunted his dreams and colored every moment of his existence for the past 2 years seemed to lighten significantly. Through his connection with this British soldier, he had found not absolution, but rather the understanding that his grief and guilt were shared experiences, not solitary burdens that he had to carry alone. James experienced a similar transformation, feeling as though a massive pressure that had been building within his chest for years was finally beginning to release. The rigid emotional control that had defined his service with the Royal Guard, while still intact, had become more flexible, more human. He realized that showing authentic emotion did not diminish his effectiveness as a soldier, but rather connected him more deeply to the values and principles he had sworn to protect. The gathered crowd began to sense that this extraordinary moment was approaching its natural conclusion, though none wished to see it end. The silence that had enveloped the entire ceremony had created a sacred space within which healing and connection had occurred spontaneously. Many of those present felt privileged to have witnessed something that transcended typical military ceremonies and touched the very essence of human brotherhood. General Morrison approached slowly, her own eyes moist with emotion as she recognized the profound significance of what had just transpired. As the senior American officer present, she felt responsible for determining how to conclude this unprecedented situation while honoring both its spontaneous nature and its obvious importance to everyone who had witnessed it. Her military mind understood that some moments required flexibility in protocol interpretation. Colonel Hartwell, representing the British contingent, moved to a position near his American counterpart, both officers recognizing their shared responsibility to handle this situation with appropriate dignity and respect. Despite their concerns about protocol violations, both senior officers understood that they had witnessed something far more valuable than adherence to regulations, something that embodied the deepest values of military service and international cooperation. Dr. Henderson continued her careful observation and documentation, recognizing that the healing process she had witnessed between David and James was beginning to extend outward to affect others present. The authentic emotion displayed by both soldiers had created a permission for others to acknowledge their own feelings about loss, service, and sacrifice. She noted how family members were embracing each other more openly and how other military personnel were making eye contact with greater depth and meaning. The morning sun had climbed significantly higher during the extended silence, and practical considerations began to reassert themselves as the formal ceremony required some form of conclusion. Yet everyone present understood that what they had experienced transcended the planned proceedings and would be remembered long after the scheduled elements had been forgotten. The spontaneous human drama had overshadowed the official memorial in the most beautiful and meaningful way possible. Father O'Brien felt moved to step forward, recognizing that his role as chaplain positioned him uniquely to help transition this sacred moment toward an appropriate conclusion. His voice, when he finally spoke, was gentle and reverent, acknowledging the profound spiritual significance of what everyone had witnessed, while helping to guide the gathering toward formal closure of the ceremony. David and James, still maintaining their connection but now with greater awareness of their surroundings, began to sense that their silent communion was reaching its natural endpoint. Neither wished to break the spell that had been cast, but both recognized their responsibilities to their respective units and the formal requirements of the ceremony that still needed to be honored. Their breathing continued to synchronize as they prepared to transition back to their official roles. The families of the fallen, who had observed this extraordinary display of authentic emotion and mutual support, felt that their loved ones had been honored in a way that formal speeches and traditional ceremonies could never have achieved. The genuine grief and connection displayed by David and James had validated their own losses while demonstrating the profound bonds that made military sacrifice meaningful and worthwhile. Mary Patterson approached Elena Rodriguez, and together they moved closer to the two soldiers, feeling drawn to express their gratitude for this unexpected gift of authentic emotion and connection. Other family members followed, creating a gentle circle around the honor guards that honored their space, while expressing appreciation for the healing and recognition that had occurred through their silent exchange. The other members of both military units began to shift subtly, preparing to transition back to formal military bearing, while maintaining respect for the extraordinary moment their comrades had shared. They understood that they had witnessed something that would become part of their unit's history and their own personal understanding of what military service could mean at its deepest level. As David and James prepared to conclude their silent communion, both men felt fundamentally changed by the experience. They had discovered that the isolation and emotional burden of military service could be transformed through authentic connection with fellow warriors who truly understood their experiences. Neither would ever again feel completely alone in carrying the weight of their service and their losses. The moment of transition arrived naturally, as if some unspoken agreement had been reached between David and James about the appropriate time to conclude their extraordinary silent communion. Their eyes, which had been locked in profound connection for what felt like an eternity, began to show subtle signs that they were ready to return to their formal military roles while maintaining the deep bond they had forged. David took a slow, deliberate breath and began the careful process of transitioning back to his official military bearing. The tears on his face had dried, leaving behind only the faintest traces of the emotional journey he had undertaken. Yet, his eyes retained a new depth and clarity that spoke of healing and renewed purpose. The crushing weight that had burdened him for years had not disappeared entirely, but it had been transformed into something more manageable through his connection with this fellow warrior. James mirrored David's movements, his own breathing deepening as he prepared to resume his position as a royal guard while carrying within himself the profound transformation that had occurred. The rigid emotional control that had defined his service remained intact, but it had evolved to include room for authentic human connection and vulnerability. He would never again confuse emotional numbness with professional strength. The gathered crowd watched with reverent attention as both soldiers began to move almost simultaneously, their actions coordinated not through any verbal command but through the deep understanding they had developed during their silent exchange. Their movements were slow and deliberate, acknowledging the sacred nature of what they had shared, while respecting the formal requirements of their respective positions. General Morrison and Colonel Hartwell approached their soldiers with expressions of profound respect and understanding. Both senior officers recognized that they had witnessed something that would require careful handling and appropriate documentation, not as a protocol violation, but as an extraordinary example of military values and international cooperation in their purest form. As David and James completed their transition back to formal attention, they maintained a subtle awareness of each other's presence that would continue long after the ceremony concluded. Their brief glances conveyed continued mutual respect and recognition, as well as gratitude for the healing and connection they had shared. Neither would ever forget this moment or the profound impact it had on their understanding of military service and human brotherhood. Father O'Brien stepped forward to deliver the closing benediction, his words carefully chosen to honor both the formal ceremony and the extraordinary human drama that had unfolded within it. His blessing acknowledged the fallen soldiers being commemorated, while also recognizing the healing and connection that had occurred between the living warriors who honored them. His voice carried the weight of spiritual significance that everyone present could feel. The formal conclusion of the ceremony proceeded with enhanced meaning and emotional depth, as everyone present understood that they had participated in something far beyond typical military functions. The playing of taps, the folding of flags, and the final salutes all carried additional significance because of the authentic emotion and connection that had been witnessed and shared. Dr. Henderson completed her documentation with the understanding that she had observed a breakthrough in military psychology and trauma healing that would influence her research for years to come. The spontaneous emotional processing and mutual support that had occurred between David and James represented a form of therapeutic intervention that could revolutionize approaches to veteran care and military mental health. As the ceremony concluded and attendees began to disperse, David and James were approached by family members of the fallen who wished to express their gratitude for the profound way their loved ones had been honored. Elena Rodriguez embraced both soldiers with tears in her eyes, telling them that their authentic emotion and connection had given new meaning to her son's sacrifice and her own grief. The two soldiers finally had opportunity to speak directly to each other, though words seemed almost inadequate after their profound silent communication. Their conversation was brief but deeply meaningful, with both expressing gratitude for the healing and connection they had shared. They exchanged contact information with the understanding that their bond would continue beyond this single moment. Representatives from military media who had documented the ceremony approached both commanding officers, seeking guidance on how to report the extraordinary events they had witnessed. General Morrison and Colonel Hartwell agreed that the story should be shared as an example of the profound bonds that unite allied forces and the healing power of authentic military brotherhood. In the weeks that followed, David and James maintained regular communication, finding in each other confidants who truly understood the unique challenges and responsibilities of military service. Their friendship became a source of strength and healing that extended to their respective units and families, demonstrating the lasting impact of their moment of profound connection. The ceremony itself entered military history not for its formal elements but for the spontaneous display of authentic emotion and brotherhood that had transformed it into something far more meaningful. The story of the Marine and Royal Guard who found healing through silent communion would be retold in military academies and veteran support groups as an example of the profound connections possible between warriors who serve with honor and authenticity. Years later, both David and James would reflect on this moment as a turning point in their lives and careers, a time when the isolation and emotional burden of military service had been transformed through genuine human connection. Their friendship would continue to deepen, serving as a reminder that the bonds forged between warriors can transcend nationality, protocol, and time itself, creating healing and understanding that honors both the living and the fallen.